Hi, this is Cameron from ZappyRide, and you're watching ZappyCast. ZappyCast is an omni-channel media production brought to you in part by ZappyRide that focuses on collaboration and conversation with the brightest minds in the EV space. Each episode will focus on different themes going on within the electric vehicle space right now. In each episode, we'll bring on guests from their relevant industries to talk about what's going on, to provide insights, knowledge, news, and talk about what's going on in the world of EVs. We look forward to you joining us for this ZappyCast. Enjoy. Today, we're joined by Chuck Ray. Chuck covers the mobility market space in North America and the evolution of electric vehicles and the electricity grid. His key areas of interest are consumer adoption, fleet electrification, smart charging, and financial innovation. He brings over a decade of experience with utility programs and mobility transformation from positions at eSource, Enernoc, RMI, and is currently switching saddles from ev.energy to Microgrid Labs. Welcome, Chuck. And we're also joined by Olivier. He's the CEO of ZappyRide. Looking forward to getting started. Nice to have you guys.
Thank you, Cameron.
Thanks, Cameron. Psyched to be here.
Glad you guys are here. So I will get on the ground running. And the first question I have is, so we'll start talking about the dealer to OEM relationship and how it's changed over time. We'll start with you, Olivier. What are some of the key changes that you've seen?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? EVs are a new technology, and there's definitely a lot of change brewing. I'm not sure that there's a lot of change quite yet, but in my view, there's a lot of change brewing in the space, and in particular in the OEM dealer relationship. You know, of course, the relationship between dealers and OEMs, the legacy OEMs in particular, right, the Fords and the GMs of the world, always been very symbiotic, but very tense, right? Because dealers have a monopoly on new car sales, and it's a highly regulated industry in all 50 states. So there's rules around dealer termination provisions, exclusive territories, franchise requirements, licensing, a lot going on here. And OEMs are not always in love with that, right? Because that tilts the relationship in favor of the dealers. In reaction to that, OEMs oftentimes control the dealers indirectly through a complex web of incentives, financial incentives, and various mechanisms to make sure the dealer interests align with OEM interests, not always with a lot of success. And I think it's fair to say, maybe Chuck, you'll disagree with me, but I think most car buyers today dislike the dealer experience. And generally OEMs push for innovation, push for improvements in that dealer experience. And the dealers sometimes react against change. So, in my view, there's this kind of push-pull dynamic and different philosophies at work. And the arrival of EVs on the scene is a way that OEMs are trying to disrupt the space, and the dealers are also trying to. And Chuck, here's to your thoughts on this, but OEMs were pushing compliance cars on dealers, and dealers were really not happy with that for a couple of years. Now that EVs are becoming a more serious segment, some dealerships seems to me, have taken the lead on understanding EVs and selling EVs, but most, it feels to me, are still being dragged into it. Do you think that's fair, Chuck?
Yeah, Olivier, I appreciate that sentiment. I do. I am going to jump all over the experience at the dealership. Is one that most consumers would like to avoid. At least that's been my experience. I find it to be incredibly frustrating. But to be fair, the higher quality or the higher price brands, the premium brands, they do, I think, really understand customer experience and can deliver, high quality experience. So I don't want to throw everybody in a bucket. It's not fair. They're coming at this from different angles, brand loyalty, multiple buys over the lifetime of an individual customer. They may even rely on, brand loyalty over, multiple generations. We see that going on as well. But there are, I bought, crazy enough, because I'm a bicycler and a pedestrian and a mass transit rider, but somehow I've ended up over the last few years buying like 4 different cars. And then I'm also speaking from a perspective of rolling out EV programs for utilities with auto dealers, which I think is one of the places, we've all connected, Olivier, Cameron. And, what occurs to me, 2 things. Number one, yes, auto dealerships, well, and manufacturers for that matter, they've been through the alternative fuel cycle more than once, right? There was a real promise around hybrids that I've heard from some dealers that think that was a big failure. The dealerships are required to buy these cars and carry the inventory, even though the manufacturer is doing all the customer testing, feature sets, financing, etc. It's a big burden on a dealership to put their capital into a product that may not move. So I think that's one hesitation, number one. Others, folks don't necessarily really like to change, may not run forward, with a big vision when it comes to EVs. Let's say, a lot of these folks are motorheads. They really like cars, and that American dream. And the first round of EVs over the last 10 years have really been, small tree hugger vehicles. So they, Tesla, I don't want to say is new on scene, but it really changed that game about what it can be. So I think just to give a little clarity for the dealership, business model, they make their money on service, or they support the business through service, right? I mean, that's a captured market. If they're newer cars, the manufacturer is really paying for that service. And then the sales of new and used cars are really where the profit is. So just to clarify that. And one other kind of interesting insight, it's not just new cars. They turn more volume on the used car side. And I think we've seen a lot of that during the pandemic, just with the crunch in supply. It really pushed people off the fence that, if they were thinking about buying a car, with that pandemic and having your own, whatever, secure space and ability to roam, that really pushed new car sales as well. So I think just from that auto dealership side, let's be fair to those folks. What I took away from that, I don't think I realized that we're often asking auto dealers to be more visionary with these new products, because that's where we are. That's the angle we're coming from. That's why we're in this the business and the line of work that we're in. Because they're really just turning inventory and looking down at service. I mean, their horizon is 3 months, 6 months at the top. For the ownership, they don't have to really come up with a new product. So I think it's best to think of auto dealers more as a distributor of that product. Right? They should be a value-added reseller. But the point is, they need to move inventory. It is inventory turns. If their customers aren't walking off the street asking for electric vehicles, they're not going to put a whole lot of interest into EV. So again, I think just being fair to the dealerships and not expecting them to lead us with new products or to convince everybody that walks off the street that's looking to buy a car that they should consider an EV, even if that isn't the beginning of their journey. I think it's a little unfair what we're expecting of the auto dealership side of the world. However, I think what really is changing, I'd like to get this part plugged in, when we're talking about business models, I mean, this whole notion of direct sale from the manufacturer, I think is absolutely powerful in the sense of it can change the entire value chain, if you will, because now the manufacturer is owning the customer experience top to bottom, from the customer research to the experience with the purchase to the delivery. And I think manufacturers are now getting their head around, electric vehicles. It also comes down to the fueling experience, which they haven't had to touch before. Coming from ev.energy, where I know you said right up front, Cameron, I'm changing roles here. But if we just think about the fueling side, the dealership traditionally has, you close that deal and then maybe you bring that car back for service. When we talk about the charging and the fueling infrastructure, I'm going to pick up and interact with that customer in that vehicle 1,000 more times, whereas the auto dealer may have only interacted 1, 2, or maybe 3 times with that customer. So I think that really changes the game, and it's something interesting to think about from an auto, dealership perspective. The manufacturer is making to order now. I mean, if we just look at Tesla with the Model 3, I just want to say, are you kidding me? They did a $500 million GoFundMe campaign by taking orders for 500,000 vehicles. If that doesn't wake us up to how this business model, can potentially change with an exciting product, it's a completely different game. Contrast that to manufacturers designing those models, really having to forecasting what will sell in each model year, and they get that exact. The auto dealer now has to figure out what they're going to buy and what they're going to carry. They don't want to miss a sale. They don't want to be carrying old models, because then we have a race to the bottom, at the end of the year. price discounts, price discounts, price discounts. You know, everybody's going to want a new model year if they're thinking about a new car. So just throwing out a few different insights I think that I've been able to take away from auto dealers. And what's changing as we start to consider, you know, electric vehicles. I think we just hit for last month, what was the number, 5.6 market share of new vehicles. And they're actually, EVs are, you know, grabbing market share from ICE as well, not just in how many are sold, but, you know, the number of ICE vehicles sold is actually dropping at a greater rate than stealing their share.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see if that sustains, you know, if and when gas prices go back down, you know, whether we continue seeing that, or I hope it's not a blip, let's put it this way. But again, high gas prices could be also here for the long, hard to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'll be interesting. I haven't seen any studies come out yet with high gas prices, how that's changing buyer behavior. I mean, we have to believe that it's leading to, I know when we hit $5 a gallon, what was that, a decade ago, something like that, the storyline, at least coming from the dealership and the manufacturers, was definitely from the dealership side. People were selling their gas guzzlers and buying smaller fuel-efficient vehicles. I haven't seen any reports come out of the major auto research trade rags yet. It'll be interesting to see if that's still the case. Olivier brings up a good question. Did you say, are you driving an EV now, or are you living the car-free life?
I live the car-free life in New York City. And I'm a big fan of rentals, EV rentals. Unfortunately, not as available as I would like, which is a whole other topic.
No, I think that's an interesting, you know, it really, you know, we're talking about consumer demand and, you know, business model at the dealership. It's an interesting concept that's been tried a few times, maybe not so successful. Maybe in the States, we're just not ready for it. But that subscription based approach to a rental car. I didn't know that Volvo put it out there. It's actually, if you lease with them, and I think it was $600 a month at the time, which is kind of like a normal price point for a new car lease, you could actually swap that vehicle in for a different model as needed along the way. If you need a bigger vehicle for a longer road trip, or a smaller vehicle for, you know, buzzing around town for the night, that may not have gone too far. But to your point, where we don't necessarily want to own a car, how can we still get those wheels when we need them?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question because we do see a lot of these services kind of popping up. To my knowledge, I don't think they've grown tremendously yet. And there's a lot, I think, a debate of what the duration is, right? You have some services that are more like, we rent it to you for one day or like a couple of days. You have services that say, okay, we're going to rent it to you for 3 months or 6 months at a time, like a very short lease, basically. And then you have, of course, the leasing model, which has always been there and will continue to be there at more like the year scale. Will be interesting to see, you know, do people want to own the vehicle? You know, in my view, whether you're doing ICE or EV doesn't really change, right? Like your desire to own or rent or lease, right, should be more or less the same, taking the economics aside. What's interesting, I think, and what's going to drive some of these decisions is availability of charging. Like, what else can we offer, right? If you think EVs will succeed in that new model, how do you make it substantially better than ICE vehicle? Because by default, they're harder, right? An EV is going to need to be charged. You have to think about charging. You have to think about all sorts of things that maybe are not problems for ICE. So if you have these new services, how can you make the EV lifestyle easier, more convenient, cheaper? And I'm not sure that's been cracked entirely yet.
I think that is a great segue in what we're talking about, you know, the user side of EVs. I always think of, you know, it's like taking public transit in a city you're unfamiliar with. The first 1, 2, or 3 times, you know, it's really challenging. And then, you know, once you figure that out, you're a commuter, you understand that system, it's much easier. Just despite the apps and all the tools, you still got to figure out what platform to get on, right? What is that timetable? Am I going in the right direction? If you have to do any modal switches. So I think you run into the same thing with EVs. Olivia, you got me thinking of, you know, one thing that EVs really need to make it easier to buy is just that opportunity to try them out, to feel what it is like to drive them in your normal environment, kind of take those first steps in charging in public. And so I think of Enterprise has, what did they, I mean, they ordered 100,000 Tesla. I'm assuming that's Model 3 and the Model Y. I don't know what the model mix was there. I think that's an excellent way to get short-term EVs in new drivers' hands. I mean, the charging network, that Tesla provides is phenomenal. It's a wonderful experience. It's everywhere you need it. It'll be interesting to see if the manufacturers are able to kind of move in that direction and do that short-term opportunity, whether it's a 3-day rental, a 2-week rental, whatever that might mean. And I just have to go ahead and plug, including fueling it with electricity as a subscription.
Yeah.
So make me go figure that out. Tell me where to go, put it on the screen.
Do you think dealers will be part of this, or do you think this will happen outside of the dealer realm?
Okay, I'll make a bet with you that 10% of the dealers, and I'm just throwing that number out as 10%, I don't know if that's very accurate, will absolutely try this model out if the model, comes forward by the products that they represent. And I say that because what I did find in the working with dealerships, and I think just to give you an idea, I mean, I think in Colorado I visited 82 dealerships, and I worked directly with something like 64 of them. So I mean, a really, really decent sized sample set for a large metro area. And what I found is, those folks who are selling EVs do a phenomenal job at it. They're really good. They're on top of it. They're turning a lot of those cars. Word of mouth brings those customers back to that dealership. I think of that as if you're going to make a large purchase, you're going to talk to somebody you trust, somebody an uncle, a coworker, a neighbor, what's been their experience. So I think word of mouth in EV sales is important. And those who are selling the EVs are doing it really well. And then you have the whole cadre that doesn't really care. It's one customer in 100 that walks in off the street, kind of looking for EVs. The sales folks don't know much about them. So back to your point, Olivier, I think those who are leaning in and interested in, new business models or just finding sales wherever they can find them and are aggressive at it and not now back or under a tree smoking a cigarette and trying to ignore the customer that just walked on the lot. Sorry, I've seen it happen. I go to another dealership after that. I'm like, fine, I'm going to go out of my way to not buy from you because it's like you got 4 models and you can't even tell me that much about each of them. It's just like, you got to be kidding me.
No, I think you're spot on here. And I really think, dealerships are going to have to make that choice because, as you pointed out, EVs do hurt fundamentally that maintenance revenue, that service revenue. I looked up some numbers. As far as I can tell, about 10 to 15% of the average dealership revenue is from maintenance service, but almost half of the margin is from service, right, and maintenance. Because of course, the revenue is a lot on the car side, on the car sales side, but the margin there is a little smaller. So, if you take the business as usual and apply that to EVs, I don't think it works, right, for dealers. So what are the opportunities and the business model changes that they should look into? And in my view, the scale matters here, right? So you have the small dealerships, the mom and pops, who, may be nimble. Some of them may be nimble, but may not have the scale and the ability to do things like you're mentioning, fuel management, handling the charging in an integrated way, or looking at leasing or short-term rentals. I think that's possible. I do think, but larger players, the large dealer groups that keep gobbling up more stores, right? That's a big trend, of course, happening in the industry. Lots of M&A in the dealer group space. I was just looking at some numbers. Lithia bought 67 stores last year in 2021. Ashbury Automotive bought 65. Group One bought 33. So there's big consolidation happening, and I wouldn't be surprised if the larger groups thought about this in a more systematic way, right, in a more long-term fashion, and did craft the type of things that you mentioned, Chuck, around how can we make charging easier? How can we organize leasing or rentals in a different way? Does it make sense to you?
I was thinking, sorry to step on you there, Olivier. I was thinking, what is it the customer needs? What are they looking for? You're not going to run into many second EV owners, right? Most of the folks you're running into as we start to enter that mass market here are first-time EV buyers. Cameron, I realize in the National Auto Dealer Association show that we were at that they asked us to be what was that, the EV garage. I think they asked a number of folks to be there, and it was very well attended by auto dealers, looking for other perspectives and where they're coming from, given the fact that we're only looking at EVs. And I think that one of the insights that came out of that we really try to impress upon them is you need an EV guru, you need an expert. You're not going to get that by talking about it. You need to drive an EV, you need to go around and charge. So Olivier, what I'm thinking about is, it's really local knowledge rules. Even though the manufacturer may offer a subscription to Electrify America, each metro or each, village, town, city kind of has their own tapestry of charging infrastructure. And that's going to continue to change as this $2.5 billion rolls out, starting next year under that federal stimulus, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So I think that local knowledge is really important. Where do you want to charge? What kind of app are you using? Really important for the salesperson to help the client or the customer through the charging profile to understand you can charge at home. If it is a multi-tenant situation, maybe that's not, a straightforward step tomorrow, but that charging at home is the lowest cost, the greatest grid benefit. I know we're not really talking about that today and overall that load management. But just to kind of wrap that up, local knowledge, EV specialty in sales, and that means put your salespeople on the first EV you get. Let them drive it for a week or two. Ask them to go charge. Pay them on the clock to do that because they're bringing important, knowledge back into the dealership that's going to help sell vehicles.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you envision that dealers, to your point, will continue the engagement with the customer beyond the sale, right? I think what you're suggesting is they'll actually maintain that relationship for a longer period of time to be their trusted advisor as they go through their new EV lifestyle.
So you're pointing to consolidation of dealerships, and I actually do not know what's behind that, so I won't prognosticate about what may be there. But I have witnessed a number of new dealerships over the last couple of years being rebuilt, and maybe that is the low cost of capital. Maybe that's something to do with consolidation. I think there's a phenomenal opportunity for dealerships because of where they're located along corridors. The fact that they own their space and that they're rebuilding to really set up high-speed fueling stations.
Yeah.
I think that's a key opportunity that really needs to be done during construction. I know that's hard to see when we're saying the dealerships, many of them other than the family-owned that have been in it for, really generations, to see around the corner and how far down the road that might be. I think it's going to quite take us by surprise how quickly a lot of this happens, not necessarily to 100% electrification, but a really rapid uptake over the next few years. We're already at the point where demand is outstripping supply. There are more EV buyers out there than EVs available for sale.
Yeah.
So we're already at that point. We can blame it on supply chain. I think in reality, 2022 has really been a pivotal year. We can kind of point to the Super Bowl ads, but manufacturers are now ready. They have new models. They have new models coming, so they're ready to start talking about it, and driving that demand. So I think it's really changed very recently.
Yeah. To your point about building charging at the dealership, I know some large dealership groups are thinking about that. And I know they're even architecting that network of chargers. And of course, the more stores you have, right, the more rooftops you have, the denser that network can be. So there's network effects there. And, on the flip side, working with folks who are trying to roll out large charging networks, like Electrify America, people like NIPA, people who work for government or government subsidized organizations trying to roll out charging. A big struggle is location, right? Where can I put a set of 150 kW DCFCs? Not easy, right? Interconnection is going to be difficult. So if dealerships can say, oh, I'm going to get a 50 kW, 100 kW DCFC on my lot, and thousands of them do that, right? That solves a pain point and perhaps adds a competitive differentiator to these dealerships. The flip side of this is, how do you monetize it in a way that makes sense, right? Because public charging is not a clear moneymaker in today's world, especially with demand charges and the cost of infrastructure, the cost of labor to build all this. So charging is great, but then is there a full business case at the end, and can you really wrap it all together in a consistent manner? I don't know that people have figured this out yet, to my knowledge.
You caused me to think of one differentiation between public charging and public charging, or maybe it's behind the fence at a dealership. Number one, we were talking about construction. They're not looking for payback on that construction immediately, and that's got to be a 20-year horizon. So I think in the same way, if they're really thinking about fast charging or the subscription side, it doesn't make any sense that they would be looking for an immediate payoff of that capital expenditure. And because I absolutely agree with you that site selection is really challenging, all the permitting that takes place around that real estate. But if you're a dealership, that real estate to you is essentially free. What are you doing? Giving up a few, parking places for a static car that you're waiting to sell, and rather you're selling electrons along the way. But I think even just backing away a little bit, big picture, in reality, we are in another industrial revolution right now. Part of that is information technology. It's all about renewable energy. It's all about zero emissions drivetrains. And the one thing that happens in industrial revolutions is not just life gets better for everybody and easier at lower cost, but it's that business models absolutely change. The incumbents often get chewed up and spit out, and the young upstarts, essentially eat their lunch. If I think of, just a few quick examples about, industrial revolutions or major business model changes when new technology comes along. I don't know. Let's think of Xerox. It's an old Harvard business case study. But what changed in buying a really expensive machine to renting that machine and then getting all the service and the ink and the paper, constantly served is we started to move to a subscription model. That's exactly what we saw in information technology. From your, not the several $1 million deployment and the whole team to run your own system. Now we're running all this stuff in the cloud. It's on AWS. And I think that's what we're really talking about with EVs and getting into the fueling side of this is where are the subscription opportunities? Because that seems to be the commonality of major business model changes. Some form of financial engineering. You don't necessarily have to pay everything up front, have a longer term relationship with you, but it's more money over time. That's a car lease. It's easy. I don't ever have to worry about maintenance. Cost me something up front, cost me a little more along the way, but I have no risk.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you get with a subscription. Fueling with electricity seems an obvious subscription opportunity.
Yeah. And so this is, I think this is the crux, of a lot of strategic conversations happening around the EV industry is how do we simplify, how do we turn this complex experience into a subscription model? And what do we include in the subscription, right? Lots of open-ended questions. There's a lot to think about as a customer, whether you're an individual buying an EV or a business converting your fleet. You have to think about the car. You have to think about the dealer, most likely in today's world today. You have to think about the utility company. You have to think about the charging, whether that's the hardware or the installation. You have to think about the incentives, right? So what I'm seeing is a couple players are coming in from different angles and looking at these, let's say, 6 or 7 aspects of the customer experience and clubbing some of them together, right? So you have people on the power side who are saying, okay, we're going to club the charging, the charger installation, and the electricity in one bundle, right? So I'm thinking people like ev.energy in Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, and a few other states. That's their approach. They're saying, okay, complex experience, 7 things to figure out, give or take. We're going to take 3 of them, make them easier for you. To your point, you have various folks in the power retail industry who are going even beyond that. And they're saying, and I'm thinking of Octopus Energy here. They announced their new offering, I think, last week.
Yeah, I saw that.
They want to lease, like provide a lease, so provide the vehicle, right, in a monthly subscription manner, but tack on top of that the energy portion of the equation, the power and so forth. So they're kind of adding one more piece, right, to that subscription-based puzzle, but perhaps not doing other pieces, because maybe not doing all the pieces is the better approach. So to me, it's really fascinating. And then you have people like Amply on the commercial side, who try to bundle, and this is for bigger fleet conversions, they bundle the charger, the installation, the financing, and it's charging as a service on a dollar per mile, right, for a fleet. And they got bought by BP, so they're doing something right, I suspect. But charging as a service on the commercial side is also a big theme. So really interesting to see how different people take different pieces of the ecosystem and trying to combine them together. On the flip side, and I'll stop there. Ironically, I do think it actually adds complexity to the universe of choices, because now a customer may think, okay, am I gonna patch the pieces together myself? So go to my dealer, go to my utility, go to my find a charging station and so forth, or do I do a bundled offering for this but not bundled offering for that, right? So now there's even more choices to analyze and dig through, especially on the business side where people try to be very quantitative. So seems to me the space is getting more complex before it gets simpler.
I'm going to have to agree with you, Olivier. At the top of the hour before we jumped on here and start, recording, we were talking about resilience and reliability, which surprisingly, has come forward in the consumer's minds. And with the F-150 Lightning, coming out and promising vehicle to home, to your point, I think this really changes the game. It increases the interest. That opportunity is truly a technology innovation that changes the way people potentially live their lives. To be able to have that home backup in an era where resilience seems to be challenging, depending on the grid, with the AC loads, the severe weather events, etc. But I'm responding, Olivier, to your point of bundling those services and how it's now becoming more complicated. It's not something I was thinking about walking into the conversation with dealerships, but now the customers are going to be asking about that vehicle to home. To your point, the utilities are offering a charging as a hardware as a service, and in return asking for control to be able to smooth that load into times that are benefit to the grid or times that take advantage of renewable energy production. So whether the dealership understands those components or not, or these newer concepts that are coming forward now, they at least need to be able to hand off the customer to, I'm going to call it a third party, but a value added, reseller that can answer those questions. Even if the salesperson doesn't know, it's reasonable to have those flyers, I think, in the dealership to help answer those customer questions. It's just, consumers aren't going to buy until they've satisfied their questions. And with EVs come a whole number of questions that were just passed with ice. I'm sure they were the exact same questions when we were going from horse and buggy to the Model T. It's like, where do I charge? How do I park? Where can I drive it? You had to address those questions. It's not something, we talk about in our case studies because we weren't there at the time. So we only know what was written then. But I think you're bringing up a really good point. Not just about the EV, not just about the charging network, but now there's these other considerations, even for the consumer and especially for the fleet.
Yeah, and tying this to dealers, one of the things we heard at some of the dealer conferences is that electricity, energy is a big cost for them too, right, in the regular operations. And so to alleviate that business challenge that EVs are posing, is there an opportunity there, right? Is there a chance that dealers become more energy savvy? And to your point earlier, before we started the conversation, that they become really good at demand management or demand response or V2X, V2G, because presumably they would be eventually the EV expert, and that includes energy experts.
I am so glad that you brought it back around from, I think a lot of us are seeing direct sales and the death of the auto dealership, right? Or just the delivery service center. But I think you really hit on something here, which is the real opportunity for these auto dealerships. They already have the dirt, they have the staff, they have the knowledge, they have the supply chain, and you're really opening up that door of other ways that they can play in this new market rather than just selling a vehicle. And I guess that's not fair. They do all the service as well, but really becoming that value-added reseller where you're doing something positive in somebody's life. I mean, selling them wheels is very positive and lets them get from point A to point B reliably, probably faster than they were doing before. Can't solve traffic. I don't know how you get past that, but nobody appreciates having to go back to or being stuck on the highway when the car fails. I'm not saying
Yeah.
EVs solve that, but what is that opportunity for that real VAR, that value-added reseller, that trusted advisor already pointed out, coming from the auto dealership, but that's where the interaction with the buyer and seller is taking place, and that's where that trust is solidified, and then that purchase accomplished.
How do you think the OEMs will navigate this in relation to dealers? And I'm talking, there's a lot of talk, right? There's a lot of, I think, appearing to be conciliatory and in favor of dealers, that OEMs have to do. They have to do the song and dance to some extent. But in the long term, do you think OEMs will, facilitate that transition with dealers in a system? That's kind of one extreme of the spectrum, right? Or will they nudge and pull and push to kind of slowly get the dealer out of the equation or reduce their role and increase the OEM's footprint in the customer experience? And it could be a combination, and many OEMs could do many different things across the space. But how do you think they'll approach it?
Yeah, I think in the U.S., I don't think we have any dealerships that are owned by the manufacturers, which is different in the European Union, where there are. I don't know that I could break it down by country, but definitely manufacturers do own dealerships as well. Not all of them, so they can deliver that seamless customer experience. And something I didn't say, that lifetime value is really what we're talking about in changing up the business model. Not lifetime value from, can I charge you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 when you come back to the service center, but, real lifetime value benefit related to both mobility and energy/electricity. But borrowing, I think what we've seen happen I think there's transit bus, same thing with school bus electrification. It's really difficult for a manufacturer to only make to order and not have a service or distribution network where you have those technical skills on the edge. Maybe that dissipates as the technologies, the products become more robust, which is kind of interesting for me to say. They're obviously very robust, but there are challenges. I'm thinking fleet operators and buses again, depending on what you're doing with charging, what you're doing operating your buses. So I don't think bus manufacturers have been able to be successful in direct only sales. If we look at Tesla, you still need that delivery center. You still need that service center, but specifically to your point, whether the OEM will lead the way or coach the auto dealers, I think it's going to be a combination of carrot and stick. They're going to really need to compensate the early dealerships that want to work with them to figure out what is going to work, for value-added products and services. But I'm sure they're also going to, require with some punitive approach if they're not delivering in a different way. I think the real issue, though, in the U.S. is, there's a legal separation between the auto dealerships and the manufacturers. So I don't know legally how much they can require as opposed to incentivize.
Yeah. And, the legal aspect here, I think, is really key because clearly, Tesla is able to navigate around the edges of the law, right, in many states to sell their vehicles without a dealer network. And I think others are taking notice, of course, and a lot of new OEMs are definitely jumping onto the direct sale bandwagon. And my understanding is that the legacy OEMs, the more traditional OEMs, are bound by the law, right, to sell through dealers. But they see EVs as an opportunity to find loopholes, basically, right, to find language that's perhaps unclear or can be challenged and say, oh, EVs are new for us and new businesses are not covered under the law with dealers. So maybe we can sell direct for this, right? I think there's a lot of that legal thinking going on with the traditional OEMs. And I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if a couple of years down the road, some of these confrontations that are under the surface right now become very obvious and a couple lawsuits happen, between dealers, dealer groups, and OEMs, as some of them try to skirt around, like find ways around the law to get what they want as far as direct sales.
Yeah, it seems like EVs are definitely that platform. I think we saw Ford, they're moving to direct sales with Lightning. I'm not sure if I saw that come from GM. Cadillac, though, I mean, they're doing something special there. I don't think they're really pushing those. I'm sure they're delivering them through the dealership. But one of the things that came out is we're going to give you a discount on that lyric if you don't discuss publicly your experience. It's kind of curious, potentially, what's behind that, if that's really competitive advantage, or if that's, brand stability, potentially. I mean, new products hard to put out. Absolutely. You want to take care of those customers very well, and we don't want, negative word of mouth being out there. So agreeing with you, it's going to be that mix. The other thing I would like to add on as manufacturers, the last few years, they had to design the new cars. They had to create those robust supply chains, despite what we see in the news, right now, with manufacturing capacity, raw materials, et cetera. I think largely, at least, they know what their strategy is if everything's not locked in, for more than 5 years. And they are really starting to think about a lot of the topics that we're touching on here is, what is that lifetime value? Where are those subscriptions? What is data worth? Not just what should I be delivering to the consumer in an in-car experience that has to do with charging as well. Also had to solve the charging at home. They've gone through those cycles now. And at least they have their initial, if not their second stage or second iteration of an offering. But it's what is the data worth? What are the grid services worth? Like, how else can I now use these cars either for a revenue stream or value-added service? I think that's the chapter that's being written right now. That's one of the things I've seen from working in that world of load management directly with manufacturers, as well as out on the edge of the network with the smart chargers themselves. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. I kind of suspect that we're going to end up, following those who have burned the path through the forest, which is Tesla and BYD. Quite frankly, we really should be paying attention to BYD. Both those products hit the road at the same time around 2012. Tesla and BYD. BYD is probably at a higher volume with a whole bunch of different models. But they have 10 solid years experience under their belt today. And we're seeing, Rivian create a wonderful in-car experience and also go, build their own charging network where they think it makes sense for their platform. Destination charging, let's call it. Parks and recreation, skiing, surfing, et cetera. Makes a lot of sense to me for how, people use their cars. And then now we're seeing the latest thing that opened up. We knew that Tesla was opening up their network. I believe that was in Europe. I think they did that in China. I'm not 100%. And so that's an open question for the U.S. It's a little apart from our discussion, here at the moment of where those insights, but I mean, they position themselves incredibly well. The biggest problem with EVs today is the charging network. The Tesla network is phenomenal, and the experience is great. So they're in a really nice position, I think, for the long run. Which, whether we understand it or not, selling cars is one of them. But really selling battery and delivering grid services and a charging network, huge investments up front. We may start to see to pay off here over the next few years.
Yeah, for sure. And what's your honest take on V2X and V2G and all this? Because it seems to me the industry is pretty deeply divided. You have the folks who say it's too complicated, too costly. Customers don't really want it, and so therefore it's a bad idea. And you have the other extreme of folks who say, primarily from an energy perspective, and to your point about resilience, it's actually really valuable to the grid, especially if we do it at scale. So it will succeed and it will happen. What's your take?
I'm going to jump way ahead and say, gosh, I hope we don't end up in the situation that we do with, with our internet service providers, where they just throttle our demand whenever they want. I don't want to see that future when it comes to EV fueling. Olivier, you're spot on. I agree. I think there are two different camps when it comes to V2X. I think we break that down as, it's a misnomer, but V1G, which is really load shift. V2G, we can think of aggregated charging delivered back for market participation or capacity, whether that's demand response. I kind of like the word also capacity response, high renewables. Let's load up the EVs that are plugged in at that point really cheaply. And then the one that's in between, which is the vehicle to building or vehicle to home. So where I fall on that is the load smoothing or the V1G, really shaping those EV load up front. That is, I don't want to say it's a no-brainer, but we need to be doing that everywhere possible. EVs just tend to be plugged in for far over 12 hours. They only need 2.5 hours to charge. That's if you're driving a lot, every day. So there's adequate opportunity to move that load in grid benefit, move it onto solar, move it onto nighttime wind, move it off of that afternoon AC. Those technologies are available today. Utilities are rolling those programs out, at least in pilot form. So that one is an absolute must. I think the numbers behind that are, if we get to a future of 50% EV penetration, I think that's wheels on the road generally in a Western country. That's something like a 30% increase in capacity required.
Yeah.
Not ideal. If we manage that charging, we're down to something like between 2 and an 8%, increase in demand. One thing I think that's really interesting to consider that when we're thinking about the grid is overbuilt. It's built to serve the maximum 100 years. So I'm going to take a number. I've never run this calculation, but I think asset utilization from an electric grid is probably below 50%. We can get more return out of our investment by delivering more kilowatt hours with that same system without necessarily increasing the price. So the load smoothing, could talk, in circles about how important that is and that it has to happen. It is happening. That will be the natural step in the future state. So I'm not worried about that at all. I really think that vehicle to building and vehicle to home is going to be quite successful. I think vehicle to building is really important in the commercial space. If we have EVs out there and we can provide a little bit of resiliency and we can manage that load, that's what people are looking for in resiliency across the board. But then when we think vehicle to grid, the manufacturers are working on it, the utilities are working on it. It's a beautiful vision. I suspect that it's difficult to do, but we have to do it with the consumer in mind. It cannot be interrupted. We can't leave anybody hanging without a charge or not getting the charge they expect to get. In other words, we can't have rolling blackouts while we're trying to, charge our cars. We need to pre-charge if that event is coming up. It's just there's been a number of notions where we, need to be able to deliver some kind of critical peak pricing and demand response at public charging, infrastructure. And I can't even think of a worse idea. If you really want to kill EV uptake, yes, let's do that. Let's just stop people's charging when they're in a public charging station and they're trying to get to the kids, recital after work and, whatever the issue was for that day and they need a quick top off.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And tying it back to dealers, I do see the power industry also reaching out to dealers and trying to get that message that you just articulated out, because we do see dealers, some of them, right, do see dealers as a channel to the customer. And I'm thinking of utilities like ev.energy in Texas or SMUD in Sacramento, California. They have dealer engagement programs, right? They reach out to dealers, they train dealers, and they explain to these dealers what you said about the grid, what you said about grid capacity, what you said about load smoothing. And they tell these dealers, we're going to give you all these materials, all this information. Please pass that along to your customer so that when the customer buys an EV, they know to call up the utility and say, okay, I'm going to sign up for this smart charging program. Or I'm going to sign up for the EV rate. So dealers have become this symbiotic partner with utilities too, which I think, very few people saw coming. But it is happening in more and more places. So yeah, unlikely allies, but I think the energy industry is trying everything they can to get that message out to the customer and make sure that there's some notional knowledge of all this. Now, of course, there's a complexity barrier, right? If you tell the dealer and the dealer tells the customer, how much lands on the customer at the end of this process and how much of it is lost? Some would argue a large percent. But nonetheless, to your point, if we want to make sure that the grid is as stable as possible, that education and that engagement has to happen in some way, shape, or form.
We love the old adage when we talk about business models that, who made the money in the gold rush? Was it the miner or was it the supply house selling the picks and shovels? So applying that to our context here with electric vehicles, auto dealers, I never really have heard reference of whoever sold the mules made all the money, but definitely whoever sold the picks and shovels did. And that's electricity as fuel.
Yes. Yes. And to your point, you definitely have the utilities. So I think the whole industry the energy industry is understanding of this. I think the power generators, with all the struggles they have to meet demand, are thinking about this. The distribution utilities are definitely thinking about this from a reliability perspective primarily. And then you have the more private players, right? The power retailers, especially in markets like Texas, who I think are all over that subscription model that you talked about. And they tend to think very, very innovatively out of the box about the customer experience. And these power retailers who tend to be seen as somewhat undifferentiated, because if you buy power from the market and you just sell it to your customer, how many ways can you do it different than somebody else? I think see it as, oh, EVs are coming in now. That's a complex value proposition that's not really solved for. How can we differentiate ourselves and offer a better service to the end customer? So yeah, I don't know if that's selling the mule or the picks or the shovels, or pick your metaphor, but I think there's a lot of thinking is going on here, and to a large extent with EVs, the technologically complex item is not the car anymore. Although it is technically complex, but there's a whole lot of complexity coming with charging, and I think some of these electricity related players are seeing it exactly in these terms.
Yeah, no doubt. The drive experience of electric vehicles is superior, and that's couch that against how far have we come in our automotive design. Pretty phenomenal. The number of gears we have, how quiet they are, efficient. I mean, really, really phenomenal how far we've come engineering wise with a complex system that has 2,000 moving parts, and now we have this kind of super simple skateboard electric vehicle that only has a few moving parts, doesn't need a whole ton of service. And here's the utilities, to your point, and you mentioned in the Texas market with the retail energy providers, free miles, rewards programs, no charge to charge on the weekends, wind and solar. So I think to your point, looking at paying attention to these really open markets that we have in the U.S., definitely California, a lot of different ways to participate there, of course, and in Texas, I think can be informative to your point to see what innovations emerge around the EV and the fueling side. And I just can't escape the notion that you've got to move up the value chain to the point of sale at the time when the driver or the new auto purchaser of an EV is really asking these questions around charging. We need to catch them at the right time, right place. I mean, that's just whatever that is F&Ps and marketing. Maybe it's 5.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, we're probably reflecting a lot of the insights we gather from our colleagues, of course, but it's a pleasure to share some of that here and just think outside the box a little bit. What are those opportunities? It is changing. I'm just going to lead with the drive experience of EV is really phenomenal and works in so many environments that you wouldn't expect. It's surprising. It's things you can only learn through the experience of driving the EV that if you talk about it just doesn't make any sense.